in. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. Welcome. This whole thing got started because years ago, some students had an amazing teacher, Stanley Feingold. He really made a deep impact on their lives, both sharpening their critical thinking skills, pushing them to sharpen their own views, pushing them to figure out their principles. These group of students became alumni. They kept in touch over the years, even after Stanley Feingold passed. They are really quite a group of characters. I enjoy talking with them each year at this event. They're really just a fascinating bunch of people who have had distinguished careers, often in public service. But they're united by this generosity of spirit that decided they didn't want to keep this to themselves. They wanted to make sure that other people got access to great teachers and great conversations through the years. It's that generosity that's part of leadership. General Powell had that same, when he said, would come back and talk to students and say, these kids are just like I was, just like the people, decades ago when I was a student. And this group of alumni have that similar generosity to say the students today they look different. If by any demographic measure they're different, but by the content of the character, they are the same as the students of years past. And so they want to support great teaching and great conversations. And through this Feingold Lecture series, we've had some really terrific conversations with folks like Hakeem Jeffries and Tish James and Jerry Nagler. And last year, Carlo and Venezia Chetty, our own Carlo. So we are very excited for today's talk. We have Micah Miller, who's Managing Director of the Colin Powell School's Moynihan Center, in conversation with Rick Stengel, author, journalist, Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, and Nelson Mandela's biographer. I've had the chance to get to know Rick in this past year as we're putting together a new fellowship for Mandela Leadership Initiative. I'm very excited about that. So there will be a couple other people to speak. I am going to next introduce my good friend, old colleague, and the president of the City College of New York, Vince Boudreau.
You'll notice that when Kevin listed the last several groups of speakers for the Feingold Lecture, there was only one each time. And I think the reason for that was the very first Feingold Lecture. Yeah, I know, you did, didn't you? They brought in someone from the left and someone from the right, and then almost in one voice, the Feingold group heckled the speakers. And so we've decided that despite what Stanley Feingold might have preferred, and he did prefer debate, we will be hearing from one speaker today, and we're really thrilled not just to have Richard Stengel speaking today, but to have him on a more permanent basis as a member of the City College community. It's a gift to our students and to our institution, and really represents, I think, a move that is absolutely in the best tradition of what this institution has always done. You will hear about Stanley Feingold from at least one of the students whose life he helped to shape. I will tell you my Stanley Feingold story. When I was, decades ago, an assistant professor at City College, after graduation, after classes, when it was quiet, when you thought you might count on coming to campus and have a little bit of peace and quiet, get your work done, I would walk past the conference room. And Stanley Feingold and George McKenna, who was at the time the chair of the political science department, would have spent the last year clipping articles out of newspapers and magazines because they had a book they published every year, Taking Sides. And it was a book that was supposed to be used in the classroom to encourage students to debate hot-button issues. And so they would talk about citizenship and abortion and immigration and drug policy and any other kind of public policy issue that was in the newspaper. And Stanley would clip out articles that defended a position on the left, and George would clip out articles that defended a position on the right. And if you knew they were in that room, just go home. Because they would keep an eye out for you as you walked by. George was usually pretty quiet. Stanley was not. He would say, "Get in here. We're having an argument. Could you settle this argument?" And then you'd be done for the day. You'd have to go through pretty much every one of the arguments as they framed it and tell them what your opinion was and have them tell you why you were wrong. But what's really wonderful about that is that process modeled exactly how Stanley thought education should proceed. He thought the job of a professor, he was very clear outside of the classroom what his views were. But he also thought that inside the classroom, his job was to make sure that every viewpoint in the room had an opportunity to be expressed, and that he didn't put his thumb on the scale. And I say that now because, look, we're in a very difficult moment for open debate, free expression, academic freedom, all of the things that have been so deeply, deeply important to this institution, were so deeply important in Stanley Feingold's career and contribution to the college, and is so evident in the lives and careers of the people that studied with and under him. And so I take this ongoing lecture, and as Kevin said, the gift that the Stengel alums, which used to be, by the way, when I first came here, they were known as the Bull and Victuals Society. The Feingold alums has a little bit more of an academic ring to it. But this is a gift that you've given us. And so I want to say to all of you that are gathered here, thank you for that. And to know that we recognize that the particular idiom that you bring to the stage today and the idiom that Stanley brought into the classroom and into your lives is probably more important today than ever before. And so thank you for that. And if you are new to the Feingold Lectures, if you are new to City College, if you are in my home department, the political science department, I really want to encourage you, apart from what you will hear our speaker present today, to see this event as a kind of salutation to the value of free and open debate, taking hard positions, defending them, and listening to people who maybe disagree with you. Anita, you're going to, I know, talk a little bit about Sid Davidoff, but I didn't want to leave the stage without saying that one of the real stalwart members of the Feingold group passed away just a few days ago, Sid Davidoff, who was a fixture in New York politics. We always would note with great, great pride, City College graduate, proud listee on Nixon's enemies list. We loved that about Sid, and he carried that fight into politics. So if you're a City College student, faculty member, staff member, alumni, that idea of this place as a place that puts some stiffness in your spine and some fight in your spirit and a willingness to struggle for the ideas that you value, but also to understand that debate is a reciprocal process, not a one-way megaphone screaming out into the void. Sid embodied that. So I wanted to say that as an institution, we mourn his passing and will remember his legacy as well. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Anita Altman to the stage. She is proud member of the Feingold Group, recipient of Townsend Harris Award of the Alumni Association, and really one of my favorite people in the whole world. And she will open the conversation and introduce our speaker. Please welcome Anita Altman.
Not at all. Hi, good afternoon. Yes, so it's my annual, I can't believe it's the 8th time I'm doing this, but to introduce who Stanley Feingold was and why we are so happy to have this lecture that memorializes him and gives him the honor that he was due. So, as you heard, the lecture series was founded by a large group of alumni in partnership with the Colin Powell School of City College to honor the memory of Stanley. A beloved, gifted professor of political science, Stanley was a proud graduate of the college and taught here for almost 4 decades. He was a passionate teacher, devoted to intellectually challenging his students. He challenged everyone's view, whether you were a liberal, a conservative, or a radical, so that students would learn that we should take nothing for granted and that it was necessary to carefully analyze all facts and opinions to which we were exposed. In these times, this is a lesson that we need now more than ever, as we see the profound destructive impact that social media and its algorithms have fostered on our body politic, and we will hear much more about that very shortly. The reality is that Stanley didn't teach. Rather, he helped each student to develop his or her own ability to learn. Thousands of students benefited from his teaching. As so many of us can testify, he made us intellectually hungry and challenged our assumptions and taught us analytic rigor and careful reasoning. He was to his students more than a teacher. He was a mentor, inspiring us to live a life with integrity and intellectual honesty, and for so many of us to pursue lives in public service. After he left the college, students of Stanley had the opportunity and good fortune to build a close personal relationship with him. We were able to meet him periodically for brown bag lunches, which were devoted to heated discussions on the issues of the day, some on a regular basis for over 35 years. For almost 2 decades, Stanley flew in from the West Coast, where he had retired, to attend them. It was only then, at these lunchtime discussions, that we learned his real political opinions that were passionately felt, but for all those years in the classroom, he carefully restrained from sharing. Moreover, he continued to write, and we were blessed to receive his many opinion pieces. Over time, he wrote a significant body of essays which revealed his humanist, progressive perspective that challenged many conventional wisdoms. A link to Stanley's writing will be sent to you all in a communication following this event, in the hope that they will be more widely read, shared, and discussed. And on behalf of my fellow alums, I really want to express our profound appreciation for truly the enthusiastic support of President Bujo, for Didi Mozaleski, who's the Senior VP for Institutional Advancement, and from the Colin Powell School, former Dean Andy Rich, the interim Kevin Foster, and Abigail Fetter-Kane, and the staff of the department, who have made it possible for us to honor our beloved teacher with the founding of this annual Stanley Feingold Lecture Series. My only regret is that Stanley is not here to receive this honor. I'm sorry, I always get to this part, and it gets really emotional for me, for which he would have felt both humbled by and grateful to this institution that he so clearly loved. I know, too, that we and his family are delighted that we're able to celebrate this remarkable man who so many of us had the great good fortune to call our teacher and friend. And finally, as Vince has just referenced, it is with great sadness that we learn that Sid Davidoff died suddenly this past Sunday. Sid had an illustrious career in politics and the law, and who, just starting out on his career, was a key figure in the Lindsay administration many, many, many years ago. He was proud to be one of the 20 on President Nixon's enemies list. Sid was a Feingold stalwart who frequently hosted our brown bag lunches, playing an instrumental role in helping to establish this annual lecture series and securing some political luminaries early in its history. He will be missed, and his memory truly is a blessing. And so now let's welcome Rick Stengel.
Good afternoon, everyone. You know, despite what we're talking about, the politics and two sides, everybody seems more on the right side of the auditorium rather than the left side. I don't know that that reflects anything. But I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And Vince mentioned that I am now a part of City College, and the way I got here was when I was at the State Department. General Powell called me, whom I'd known for a long time, and ordered me to come and speak at the Colin Powell School, at my school that he called it, about public diplomacy, and I did. And I kind of fell in love with the place, and I met a bunch of students, and they gave me a hard time, which I appreciated, and Andy invited me back, and we eventually came up with this terrific program that Kevin mentioned, the Nelson Mandela Project for Social Change, which is about something we've already talked a little bit about, which is overcoming polarization. I mean, there's nobody that overcame a worse polarization than Nelson Mandela did. And that is what we will try to teach and what we hope kids will learn. And the first course will be this spring. So I'm excited about that. I did not have the honor and privilege of knowing Stanley, but I did have teachers and professors that changed my life. And in a way, that's what we're celebrating here. That mentorship, the guidance, the leadership that can change the trajectory of people's lives. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for these critical teachers in my life. And I'm sorry I didn't know Stanley, but he did that for lots and lots of people. So the talk today, and you'll see Mike Miller later. You know, I've been a journalist for a very long time. When you write an article or a magazine piece, you write it first and then you come up with the title. When you give a speech, you have to come up with the title before you give it. And Mike came up with this grandiose title, Beyond the Marketplace, Fact, Falsehood, and democratic discourse. And I tried to model the speech for that. But that is what we're talking about today and why it is so important to talk about the protections for free expression, the genesis of where that came from, and that is how I'm going to start today. So back on a sweltering summer day in 1918, on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, the end of World War I, a Russian immigrant factory worker in a hat factory on the 4th floor threw some anti-war pamphlets out the window onto the street. They fluttered to the ground. A pedestrian picked it up. He looked at it. He handed it to the cop on the beat. 3 hours later, a bunch of policemen came in and arrested Hyman Roshansky, that 21-year-old hat worker who threw that pamphlet, and 3 other men who had conspired to do this anti-war pamphlet. They were arrested under the Sedition Act of 1918 for impeding American war production and inciting resistance to the draft. Their case, which became known as Abrams versus United States, went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and their defense counsel argued that the First Amendment protected the right of dissent, the right of protest. It seems like something we all agree with, right? But in 1919, the First Amendment only protected what was known as prior restraint. It only protected the government from interceding and not publishing something. From the time that the First Amendment was passed until 1919, there had only been 5 First Amendment cases that had ever appeared in the Supreme Court, and they weren't about freedom of expression. In fact, it wasn't until 1925 that the Supreme Court even decided that the First Amendment applied to the states. So these handful of men were convicted by a vote of 72 in the Supreme Court for inciting resistance to the U.S. war effort and using, this is the language, disloyal, scurrilous, and abusive language about the U.S. government. Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great justice, the greatest writer of all Supreme Court justices, in my opinion, wrote a beautiful, short dissent that has become the basis of the marketplace of ideas defense of freedom of speech. And here it is. When men have realized that time has upset many fighting faiths, they may come to believe that the ultimate good desired is better reached by free trade in ideas, that the best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market, and that truth is the only ground upon which their wishes safely can be carried out. That, at any rate, is the theory of our Constitution. So that idea of the marketplace of ideas was most beautifully summarized by Holmes, but it goes back even further. It goes back to the Enlightenment ideas of the framers, and it goes back to an even earlier stage in English history. In 1644, the great English poet John Milton published an essay called Areopagitica, which was an attack on the British government for the fact that it licensed all newspapers, all essays, all books. And he said that it was a form of censorship and that truth only arises through contest and open debate. Milton wrote, "Let truth and falsehood grapple. Whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter." That idea that truth emerges through a clash of ideas and depends on an open exchange of views is the very basis of our First Amendment. Madison said that only information, true information, is how people arrive at the consent of the governed, which is how we operate, that phrase from the Declaration of Independence. This idea, as I mentioned, has been around since the start. Here's Benjamin Franklin in 1731. "When truth and error have fair play, the former is always an overmatch for the latter." Thomas Jefferson in his first inaugural in 1801. "Error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it." And all the way to JFK. We all know that's John F. Kennedy. "A nation that is afraid to let its people judge the truth and falsehood in an open market is afraid of its own people." But, how does that happen exactly? How does truth overmaster falsehood? Does truth get falsehood in a headlock and wrestle it to the ground? Is truth somehow more powerful and pins falsehood to the ground? How do we know truth when we see it? Does it come underlined in yellow? Do people somehow recognize truth and buy it and put falsehood out of business? This marketplace idea of truth, of the First Amendment, is a lovely, beautiful, idealistic idea, and I devoutly wish it were true. But I'm afraid it's something of a fairy tale. The idea of truth, this same idea of truth magically winning out of falsehood, is the basis of New York Times versus Sullivan, the 1962 case, which is the basis of modern free speech law. It protected freedom of the press, and it determined that it was almost impossible, and should be almost impossible, to libel a public figure unless you wrote the story with actual malice, which is that you knew it to be false at the time you were doing it, or a reckless disregard for the facts. The idea, and this also goes back to Madison, is that it was so important in a republic that elects its own leaders to be able to analyze those own leaders that the law needed to tolerate falsehood in pursuit of truth. So in that case, in New York Times versus Sullivan, William Brennan wrote, "There is a profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust and wide open," it sounds like Stanley, "and that it may well include vehement, caustic, and sometimes unpleasantly sharp attacks on government and public officials." In fact, because of that case, the modern court protects error for the sake of truth, even though, as the court said, there is absolutely no constitutional value to false statements. The value it has is that it helps you to ferret out the truth by contrasting them. Even Citizens United, which got rid of all the regulations and campaign finance donations, cites the marketplace ideas of the First Amendment to justify it. But, how is this market working now? How is this contest working now? How is this interplay working now? Let's talk about that. So, about 6 years ago, I published a book called Information Wars, which was a look at the rise of mis- and disinformation, both domestically and around the world. When I started writing it and talking about it, that word, disinformation, was unfamiliar to people. It was novel. I went and did a fantastic search with ChatGPT that showed a graph of the word had not been used from the 1940s until 2012, and then it spiked in 2014. The word and the concept come from Stalin's Soviet Union. It was invented by the intelligence services. It's called disinformatia. It's the use of false information to get a point of view out there to follow the propaganda that you're trying to get out there. And here's how it used to work, and this is a real example. You take a conspiracy theory, which the Russians probably invented, that AIDS was invented in a military laboratory at Fort Detrick, Maryland, by the CIA, and you take that story and you find a small newspaper in India or Italy, and you bribe a journalist to publish that story, and then you hope that it gets picked up. And eventually it does often get picked up. That was how disinformatia worked. Now, the brilliant insight of disinformatia were two things. One, it should always have more than just a kernel of truth. It should seem plausible. And the other thing was that you didn't actually have to believe it. If it confused you, if it made you doubt reality, that was success. And that's how that has worked, and that has worked, for all of these years. So in 2014, when I was at the State Department, the US government discovered there was something called the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, Russia, which was what we now call a troll farm. And it was a place where young Russian men and women walked in and out every day, and they created personas for themselves, maybe a teacher in Des Moines or a lawyer in Kansas City, and they interfered with and tried to change the result of the US election in 2016. This was written about in the Mueller report. There's amazing examples of it. It's a fact. And it was something that we saw because so much of it was directed toward us. I started getting texts and social media, they were pretending to be Americans, but there were so many wrong phrases, so much spelling mistakes and grammar mistakes. And then we found out that they were coming from a Russian domain name. That's what these internet trolls were doing. And it was something that you could see, and it was different than other things that you could see. You could say that was not a fact, and this is a fact. But what has changed in this larger environment that we're going to talk about now is the fact that disinformation has become democratized. Everybody, can be a vector of mis- and disinformation. The firehouse of falsehood is everywhere. Conspiracy theorists have been mainstreamed and professionalized. Some are called influencers, and they cover the White House. AI has taken the cost of creation to zero. Distribution for content was once the hard part. Now, because of the internet, the cost of distribution is also zero, and the reach is infinite. When the marketplace of ideas model was originated in the 18th century, one of the sources of it was the great Adam Smith, the Scottish economist. And he was the philosopher who invented the idea of the invisible hand, the idea that capitalism and that markets work to naturally benefit the consumers through competition, and competition also creates efficiency. But today, what has changed and distorted the market is that these content companies, the platform companies, make the market. And they are not neutral machines for content. Their design, their engagement metrics, their algorithmic ranking are the new invisible hands of information. Information asymmetry, amplification bias, scholars have written, distorts that market, and that invisible hand privileges profits, emotion, and virality. Cheap speech creates more bad speech, which is then multiplied at an exponential scale. As René DiResta has said, the supply of disinformation will soon be infinite. When I was working on information wars and when I was at the State Department, I mean, it just wasn't that many years ago, but there was an environment where people felt like, I can tell that something is the truth, I can tell that something is a falsehood. Going back to all the examples that I gave earlier, there was a distinction between factual information and information we knew not to be a fact. But we're living in a different environment now, where the President of the United States is himself a fire hose of falsehood that is echoed by cabinet ministers, echoed by influencers or propagandists. The whole playing field has changed. That has caused the kind of world to pivot on its axis. I saw it was on the flyer for the talk today, but I wanted to mention Pat Moynihan's famous benediction that you are entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. But that presumed the idea that we could tell what a fact was, and that there was a general agreement on what a fact was. That seems incredibly quaint today. People believe in their own facts. The great sea change, in addition to the democratization of disinformation, is that speech is no longer scarce, but attention is. When the First Amendment was written, there was a quarter of households in America that owned a book besides the Bible. Only half of free white males could read and would read newspapers. Everybody else couldn't do that at all. Speech in those days needed protection because it was rare. Today we live in a time of information overload. Content is infinite, but our time is not. Hence the attention economy, where so much content is competing for so little time. A wealth of information, the economist Herbert Simon once wrote, creates a poverty of attention. That's the problem we all have. But the challenge today is something different than that early day when the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law, was preventing the intercession of government to suppress speech. The challenge today is not so much state suppression of speech. The challenge is private suppression of speech. Troll armies and bots and influencer mobs can drown out and suppress speech. Harassment and threats and doxing intimidate speakers. This is what Steve Bannon has called flooding the zone with shit. Speech itself has become a weapon of censorship against other speech. Brandeis's famous argument that the remedy for bad speech is more speech just doesn't work anymore, if it ever did. Indeed, private suppression of speech is more effective than government suppression today. Just look at Jimmy Kimmel. His ratings are better than they ever have been. That was an attempted state suppression of speech, and it didn't work. But the First Amendment, like other guarantees in the Bill of Rights, has always been understood as a negative right, a right against coercive government action. It has never been regarded as a right that obliges government to create a more perfect speech environment. And maybe it should be, and that's something that we'll talk about. But today, the larger question is, what does the First Amendment protect and permit and tolerate? Does it permit online mobs that intimidate journalists? Does it permit hate speech that targets people of color and religious minorities? Does it permit foreign actors to try to influence US elections? Should the platforms themselves be treated as public utilities? Yes, by the way. A number of recent studies have actually shown that peak social media is over. So I would say amen to that. But a modern marketplace of ideas should work for the audience as well as the content creators. Democracies, as Madison said, depend on factual information. But the danger for a democracy is when voters and people can't decide on a shared set of facts. You can't legislate to have people tell the truth. But why wouldn't you want to create a system that highlights facts and helps uncover the truth? Only bad actors don't want to do that. Thank you very much. Mike.
Thank you, Rick, and I want to say thank you. I actually don't know how to put these mics the right way. Thank you to the Feingold alumni. I want to just actually start by saying how moved I was to hear about Stanley Feingold's influence on all of you. And I was thinking to myself, man, I wish that I had had a professor like that in undergrad. I did have one really good professor in grad school. He's now the president of a mid-sized public university in Harlem, New York. Never had me over for dinner, I will note, but he did inspire me nonetheless. I just think it's remarkable that you all are doing what you're doing and that you're still in touch with each other. And I wish that for my own students, that they stay in touch with each other and really, motivate each other to have these kinds of conversations. Rick, I'm really happy to be here with you. My father is jealous that I'm here speaking with you. He said he's actually watching my kids right now. And I think had he known that this event was happening, he wouldn't have agreed to do that. So I have a few questions, and then we'll open it up to Q&A, and I'll signal to everybody when it's going to be the Q&A, and you can come up here to the microphone and ask your questions. But I want to start out with a question about the marketplace of ideas. And you argue, I think persuasively, that the marketplace of ideas is kind of a fairy tale, that there's not really a mechanism by which the truth naturally defeats falsehood, that it wrestles with falsehood and emerges victorious. But I wonder if the problem isn't the market metaphor itself, but rather a kind of laissez-faire epistemology with which there's an assumption that an ideas market can function without institutional infrastructure. I think most of us don't assume that economic markets self-regulate, that we know they need things like antitrust law to prevent market failures like monopolies, for example. And when we invoke the marketplace of ideas, we often assume, I think implicitly, a set of institutional gatekeepers. In professional journalism, you have editors, fact-checkers, norms like retracting things that were stated that were, that ended up being false. You have lawyers. In academia, we have peer review, replicability, conferences, associations, and the like. And maybe the metaphor worked tolerably well. Not because the truth naturally wins, but because there were well-established rules governing the competition. So my question is, this is kind of a long wind-up, but my question is, if we take the market metaphor seriously, if we say that ideas and an ideas market needs rules, just like economic markets do, then what do those rules look like today? What should those rules look like today?
Mike, it's a terrific question, and it's a logical one, because it is a market. The great barrier to having the government regulate the market is, in fact, the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or of the press. We've had decades and decades of history of the government staying away from content, from regulating content, but these are gigantic businesses. In fact, one of the reasons it's a gigantic business is something which people have probably heard, Section 230, which was part of the Communications Decency Act of 1996, long before Google or Facebook. And basically, Congress said that these new platforms, which are using user-created content, shouldn't be regulated like Time Magazine, where I worked, or the New York Times, or any publication, because they weren't professional journalists. So they were allowed to escape the liability provisions that I would be subject to if I libeled someone or defamed someone in Time Magazine or some other place. It helped create a gigantic industry, and that is an example of the kind of foresight of law. But it also, once the industry's changed, the law needed to change. So one of the big things that I've campaigned for since writing Information Wars has been to change Section 230 and give the platform companies some liability for the content that they have. They were not treated as publishers because they weren't traditional publishers, but they're the biggest publishers in the history of the world. They wouldn't have the same liability as the New York Times, but I think they should. And it's one of these rare areas that there is some kind of consensus, because you hear people on the right, including President Trump, saying it's Section 230 that's allowing the platforms to regulate and get rid of conservative voices. I don't think that's true. But if there is a consensus about reforming it, that I think would be a good thing. I think there are also things that I've also talked about that other scholars have talked about, the transparency of algorithms. So I'm not as hardline about algorithms as some people, because they just give you more of what you want, and it depends on, if you're interested in irregular Latin verbs, you're going to get a lot of, ablative forms that you've never seen before. But the point is that the algorithm is opaque. You can't see into it. It's the Coke secret sauce. Algorithms need to be more open. You need to be able to change them. You need to be able to say, I don't want to see anything that I would consider hate speech, or I don't want to see any images of violence. So I think being able to regulate algorithms is something that it's not necessarily the government should do, but if the government passed a law saying that platform companies have to open them, that's not a bad idea. There's just small things that I think are perilous to the information world, which is something I've also written about paywalls. I know, newspapers and magazines have to make money, and I understand how paywalls work, but paywalls get in the way of that free flow of information, which is what the First Amendment was supposed to safeguard. I've always been in favor of a kind of easy pass system where you pay for each article that you see, a matter of pennies. I think the content companies would make even more money from that. And then maybe, you put a tariff on disinformation.
Tariffs are popular these days.
And let's maybe use them for something that actually would be beneficial. So I think there are ways that the government with a light hand, not an invisible hand, could actually change the market and make it more biased in favor of fact and truth.
I feel like a few years ago, I would have agreed with you that there's bipartisan consensus to reform platforms, because I know there was so much critique of platforms coming from the left, and there was critique of platforms coming from the right. And then Elon Musk bought X, and I wonder if today there'd be the same level of bipartisan support for that regulation. So here's a question. Do you think today there still is or would be that bipartisan support for it, or have things just changed in the last few years?
Well, it's a good question. Part of the reason there was traditionally conservative support for that is because conservatives felt that they were prejudiced against, that their content was demoted on search engines, that the old Twitter was getting rid of conservative voices. There's now a kind of a conservative hegemony now in media. And I don't think the mainstream media is about to go away yet, but they might not want regulation because they feel now that they're the top dog. I mean, speaking of Elon Musk, I just had been reading in the last couple of weeks about his creation of a kind of his own version of Wikipedia. He calls Wikipedia Wokepedia, and he's creating something called Grokpedia, which has an algorithm that biases the results in favor of conservative points of view. it's funny because when Wikipedia started, I think a lot of scholars and serious people didn't take it seriously. And now it's sort of the factual foundation of the internet. And the fact that it allows people to form a consensus about what is factual and what is not is an interesting model that people can understand. I mean, you know, that's a whole other discussion about deciding what is a fact and what is truth. Yeah. But the fact that they are trying in good faith to come up with an answer is different than these kind of conservative biased algorithms that are refuting anything that they consider woke.
Yeah. You know, I'll just one quick aside. It's interesting. I'm teaching a class this semester, as you know, called Truth in Politics, and one of the things that we talked about is Wikipedia. And one of there's many things I think differentiate Wikipedia from the broader digital ecosystem, but one of the things is that the goal in Wikipedia, ultimately, as much debate as there is on Wikipedia, is to create one page. Which is to say the goal is to create a shared reality in contrast to, you know, debate on Twitter or Facebook where people are kind of pushed into their own, you know, multiverse of realities. And maybe this is a good segue to my next question, which is on different kinds of markets. You know, I think toward the end of your lecture, and I think we're now beginning to talk about it, you invoke a third kind of market in addition to the economic market and the marketplace of ideas. So now we must contend also with what are frequently called attention markets, or the attention economy, in which algorithms operate, and I love the way that you put this, as kind of in a new invisible hand, and I really like that framing. Can you unpack what's going on here, and is the problem the attention economy business model itself, which, you know, it strikes me operates kind of like an economic market, or according to an economic market logic. It gives people more of what they want, or what's popular. It's kind of optimized to allocate preferences in that regard, rather than an ideas market logic, which I think should be anyways optimized for accuracy or truth. And so is there just a fundamental problem with the attention economy business model, or is it possible for us to tweak the design of algorithms and to help mitigate this challenge?
No, it's a great question, and I go back to the early days of the internet, and of course it was an idealistic enterprise. It was about giving everybody on the planet access to every bit of knowledge that existed on the planet, and it was, to use a kind of inelegant phrase, there was an interoperability in the early days of the internet where you could find information on different platforms and circulate on different platforms. With the rise of Facebook and the other big platforms, they became sort of walled gardens. They didn't want you to leave their site. And one of the ways they did that is they became relentless pursuers of your attention. They didn't want you to leave. Instagram doesn't want you to go anywhere. So so their algorithm seeks out your attention. It seeks out things that you're interested in and keeps you involved. That they end up making more money. So they're optimized for profit, and attention is what gives them the profit. The reason I'm not as sort of angry about this as some people is because I've always been in the content business. The content business is about getting people's attention and making them pay attention. Some of you will remember the early editor of New York Magazine, a guy named Clay Felker, who I thought was sort of the greatest editor of his generation. And he used to say, magazines are an addiction. And everybody who creates content wants people to get addicted to it. It's just now the engine of that, the technology for that, is so much greater than it ever has been before. But all through history, when people wrote books that that had 3 or 4 books in order, you wanted people to get addicted to that, so you'd read that. I mean, the benefit, as you were suggesting, is to try to turn that addiction market, that attention market, to something that is more valuable. But until, we talked about it earlier, if you wanted to regulate Facebook or Google or Alphabet as a public utility, which it essentially is, then you might be able to change that a little bit. But the thing that I find consolation about is that, yes, our attention span is shorter, but it also moves on to other things. So none of those platforms become so deeply embedded that they're something that we have a loyalty to above compared to anything else. So one of the things now that you're seeing in search, because of AI and ChatGPT, the Google search engine, which was a miracle, would give you a list of references if you ask, who is Mike Miller? Here's a piece from City College, here's a piece in the New York Times, and you, like a scholar, put together the information and come up with an outcome. Now, you do search, and even on Google, because of AI, they just give you a paragraph on who Mike Miller is without those references. I mean, that's a different way of operating. So once upon a time, the idea that Google was this incredible hegemon that between Google and Facebook, they got 85% of the advertising market. Those things are going to change. And whether it's Netscape or other platforms that were so big 25 years ago, they're gone. Ones that now we think will never go away may be gone 20 years from now. And by the way, that's why people don't necessarily want to regulate things.
Yeah. And I'm sad to report that even if you Googled Michael Miller at City College, I wouldn't be the top name, because there's an associate dean named Michael Miller here. So as the managing director of the Moynihan Center, I appreciated your call out to Senator Moynihan's dictum that everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but not their own facts. But you suggest that this distinction between fact and opinion, even between fact and fiction, seems to have vanished. And I suspect that you don't mean the distinction has literally vanished, right? Germany either did invade Belgium in 1914 or it didn't, but rather that people just have stopped caring about the distinction. And if that's true, how do we overcome what seems to be a kind of cultural decay and not simply an institutional failure, which I think is what we've been talking about thus far?
So, I'm going to give a disappointing answer in the sense that I think it's always been thus. I mean, Pontius Pilate asked Jesus, "What is truth?"
Yeah.
This question, I mean, the books in the library about the nature of truth, fill shelves and shelves and shelves. I mean, it's not just an epistemological issue. I mean, it's a religious issue. It encompasses everything. So I've actually mainly stopped using the word disinformation because it has been hijacked by people on the right. There's so much mirroring in the information space that people on the right thought, oh, people on the left are calling them disinformationists, so of course they have to call you a disinformationist back. And so the word has kind of lost some of its power. And because I do want to hear what the other side thinks, I don't want to alienate people by using a word that has a valence that will automatically make them opposed. So I think it's much safer to use the word fact rather than truth, the word falsehood rather than disinformation. There's a terrific company called NewsGuard that I'm on the board of that does kind of ratings of the factuality of newspapers and magazines. They've also stopped using the word disinformation. So we were talking before about, I mean, there are some things that I hope we could all agree on our facts. 2 + 2 = 4. Albany is the capital of New York State. And I think going back to like the Pat Moynihan and talking about what I was talking about before Nelson Mandela, part of the way of getting past polarization is making a decision. What are the facts that we share in common? Let's start with things that we can agree on and then build from there. So I do think, that's very hard in our culture right now. But the Venn diagram of where left and right can agree on certain things is something that you want to widen.
Mm-hmm. So this is my last question, and then I want to invite people, if you do have questions, to start lining up now. But there's a bunch of people in the room. They are Moynihan Public Service Fellows, and they will soon enter knowledge professions themselves or need to work closely alongside folks in knowledge professions. And I think there are many in the government who I would include in that group. What is your advice for maintaining professional commitments to the truth when the system may not reward it and may even punish it?
So I'm glad you asked that. When I covered politics for many years, I went into government and worked for President Obama during the last 3 years of his term. I've been in and around Washington for decades and decades, and then I was in government. And one of the things you realize, and I'm sorry if it's obvious, but the civil servants, the people who work in the agencies in Washington, are people that are doing it because they believe in the country, they believe in the Constitution, they're trying to do the best job possible. They're working for salaries that they would be less than they would get in the private sector. This idea that there's a swamp among civil servants, that there's something called the deep state that's trying to undermine the country, is really just a terrible canard that has traditionally been used by the right. Although conservatives were once, people who supported the civil service too. So I think it's sad if the current sort of disdain for government, which started, not with Donald Trump, but with Ronald Reagan, who said government isn't the solution, government is the problem. I'm not saying the government is the solution to everything, but people in government are trying to come up with solutions that benefit the American people. So one way to, if you're going to serve, and part of this idea of serving is whether you're a lawyer, whether you're in the military, whether you're in the civil service, there are regulations that say you can't follow an illegal order, you can't give a falsehood in court. Every one of those jobs has a kind of Bill of Rights or 10 Commandments that says you can't violate these principles, you can't violate constitutional principles. And by the way, in each of those cases, you take an oath to the Constitution, which is something that is exemplary and different about the United States, and something that was invented 250 years ago. So I think if you keep those values front and center, you want to work for the American people, that'll keep you on the right course.
Thanks for that. So yeah, if folks from the audience do have questions, please line up to the microphone right here. Don't be shy. Yes, sir. And I would ask people, say your name and where you're coming from before you ask your question.
Awesome. Hello, Rich.
Hi.
Is this on? Oh, awesome. Hello, Richard. My name is Nixon Frederick. I am a sophomore currently studying economics at CCNY. It's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you so much for sharing your insights tonight. 2 questions for you.
Yeah.
The first question is, earlier in your speech, you mentioned how editing Section 230 would be a great way to kind of manage this age of disinformation. Could you walk us through what that looks like? And second question is, for the younger generations like myself, what is some advice that you have on how to, get in the front lines of this war of disinformation, especially in this age of AI? Nowadays, it's so easy for someone to just go online, create an artificial video that makes something that's completely false looks real. For instance, the wildfires that were happening in California, someone created a video making it look like the Hollywood sign was burning down, and that quickly spread. making a lot of people believe that the Hollywood sign actually did burn down. Do you have any advice for the younger generation on like how to manage that?
You know, in even preparing for today, I always think that the people who should be talking about mis and disinformation, about truth and falsehood, about algorithms, are technologists and computer scientists. They understand it in a way that the lay person does not. And so I'm always telling people, you know, if you're a computer scientist, if you're an engineer, get into this debate because you will understand it in a way that other people do not. You know, Section 230 came about in part because it was there was a lawsuit that one of the early platforms, that someone was sued for libel because of something that a person who was just on the platform had insulted someone else. And Congress, and there were some technologists in Congress then, and said, these platforms will all die out if we give them the same liability that a professional publication has. And it was the thing that helped them to grow, because they understood that, unlike almost any time in human history, the content was created by the participants rather than by professionals. And to go back to the first point, I mean, part of we're entering a new age with AI, with things like Sora and Sora 2. So Sora 2 creates, you know, videos. You know, if you put your face in it and it has a supply of information. I remember a few months ago, one of my sons showed it to me and made a video of me dunking at Madison Square Garden. I'm
Totally worth
telling
it.
you that never happened. But part of the problem with deep fakes and with things like Sora 2 is that they don't come with watermarks necessarily. People don't know whether they're true or not. Not that I want to, you know, harp back on the Russians, but the Justice Department recently announced a case where Russians were paying people to create content on Sora 2 to follow the Russian line in Ukraine. In fact, there was a video created that showed Ukrainian soldiers surrendering and crying that had been created using Sora 2. So it's a brave and dangerous new world out there. And again, to go back about regulation. So for example, people have talked about content created using AI should have a watermark that says it's created by AI. I would obviously support legislation like that. Some people would say that's a violation of the First Amendment. There's the question of, is content that's created by a non-human actor protected by the First Amendment? That's also something that should be legislated. So there's just a lot of questions, but I would welcome you to get into the space.
Awesome. Thank you, Richard.
So it seems like we got one more question, and then after this final question, please don't leave because we're going to have just a few more remarks from Karen Feingold. Oh, sorry. Looks like we got two questions. All right. We're going to we're going to roll these ones together. So you first, sir.
Hello. My name is Ilya. I'm studying economics here in City College. My question is about journalism. Recently, we saw the case of BBC where executives had to resign due to accusations of bias. And this is the very same BBC whose charter before was considered as an iconic for journalism and true information. I want to ask you what happened to these giants of media and newspapers, why they're getting these accusations, why there's so much disinformation in these giants, and what can we do with that? Thank you.
So the question was about what happened at the BBC recently, and I have to say I have read about it. I never watched the video that they said was edited in a way that was discriminating against Donald Trump. But I'm perfectly prepared to believe that that's the case. I mean, I've always said that, journalists are biased. They're biased in favor of getting their story on the front But generally, journalists and all the studies over the last 25 years have shown that journalists do have a liberal bias. The case that I thought was more interesting is the CBS case, where Donald Trump sued CBS and 60 Minutes for how it edited a video of Kamala Harris to make her look better. Now, that I did look at. And, you know, one of the things that I've always bemoaned about discussions of journalism is that people don't really know how journalism operates. You know, that there are editors, and there are fact checkers, and there are libel lawyers. And so if you look at that CBS case, they created one video for the commercial for the interview. They created another video that promoted before the actual interview. Then they created the actual interview. You edit an interview to try to have the most interesting things in it. And people, and this was Donald Trump's suit, and I assume that some percentage of it was disingenuous because he knows that that's how it operates. But the fact that there are people and millions of people who thought, yeah, that's a terrible thing that they did, I mean, they're sued for committing journalism. That's sacrilegious in my book.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ron Goldbrenner. I graduated in 1962, and I was a student of Stanley Feingold. And I have to tell all the students that are here that everyone except 3 flunked Feingold 101, because we would have had a line going all around the back for people to ask questions, disagree, fight, give their own opinions, and all the rest. So next time, do better. All right. With respect to your lecture, I think it's one of the most brilliant we've had, because it defines the new paradigm of structure and process for not just free speech, but for markets too. And one of the fallacies of condemning markets is that they often condemn the rules, not the structure. Structure may be sound, but the rules and how they're enforced don't work. So that, for example, antitrust, there's nothing wrong with the structure, it's with how the rules are made up. Everything needs rules. Free speech has never been free. We always had obscenity and defamation and national security and copyright and all. So it's a matter of what is the structure and what is its parameters. You can't have any baseball, football, basketball game without rules. You can't have markets without rules. And what you've described today brilliantly is a fact that the structure and process we used to use doesn't work anymore. Things that have happened, technological, political, and all the rest, have overwhelmed the old structure and the way of doing things. And Mr. Miller's first question was great in that it approached this, but I'm asking for even more about how we can study and teach the structures, the way structures should operate now, and the process. What's the process we need? And then you're looking at the ideal, and you say, okay, this is what's going on now. This is what we've got to change. I think that's what you were saying brilliantly. But I just think it will be formulated more in structure and process.
Great.
Let's let Ava come on up to the microphone, and you can ask your question too, and then Rick can answer both together.
Oh, just to respond to that?
Ava's going to ask a question, and then you can respond as you like, and then I'd like to
My name is Ava.
save time for
I'm
Karen.
an economics major in my senior year, and I was wondering, so I worked a little bit in IP law, and I got to look at some, sorry, I'm a little blind right now because my contact fell out. So I got to work in IP law this summer, and I got to do some work with with patents. I don't know why. But I got to see a little bit of the business perspective of the way social media and technology works. I can't go into the details of exactly like what the patents were, but how is it possible to regulate social media and all of that without infringing on the rights of businesses and without hurting the businesses, because social media is a very strong business and it does a lot for our economy. So what would that look like?
No, it's a good question. And I mean, as I said before, I've always been in the content creation business, and I've worked for companies. I mean, newspapers have been for-profit endeavors in the whole history of the Republic. It's only now that some of them are becoming nonprofits. So there is this profit incentive. But there's also the idea that a platform like Facebook is more like a public utility. It's the way that people communicate with each other in a way that is makes our politics, makes all of the things that we do. So I don't know if it would be infringing on a patent, but just looking at the way regulation for how these companies might be regulated, still allow them to make a profit, but actually to kind of bias the choice architecture in a way that's better. But I mean, that's a great thing. I mean, if you were to go to law school and figure that out, that would be a great benefit. Speaking of the law, I just want to say in reference to the gentleman's previous comment, I had written a piece some years ago about the idea that states and municipalities could experiment with the idea of regulating or outlawing hate speech. And, you know, people came and piled on and said I was against the First Amendment. But part of the problem is that we have made the Constitution itself too difficult to amend. Jill Lepore, who's a writer for The New Yorker and a professor at Harvard, has a new book out called We the People, which is basically about this idea that one of the problems of the original conception of the Constitution is that it made it too difficult to amend. Because the states are the laboratories of change, pass laws that then go up to the Supreme Court and make a judgment about whether it's constitutional or not, or allow the legislatures or the states to vote on changes. I mean, Thomas Jefferson said the Constitution should be reimagined every 17 years. Why he chose 17, I don't know. But we've just made the law too difficult to change in ways that could benefit us, and that also speaks to your question. So thank you.
So folks, please join me in thanking Rick for this amazing talk. I found this invigorating. And now Karen Feingold, I believe, is going to come up onto stage and say a little bit about her father.
Thank you both so much. My father taught political science at CCNY for nearly 40 years. And in all this time, he never revealed his political allegiance to his students. Instead, he challenged every student to argue thoughtfully and respectfully, placing them in the unfamiliar seat of defending opposing views. With patience, he drew them closer to seeing, even for a moment, what the other side believed. Away from campus at home, my father was the same. He never handed down his beliefs to us like commandments. He wanted us to wrestle with ideas until they became our own, to be able to stand in front of others with our convictions rooted in thoughtfulness and compassion. Even when we disagreed, which happened often and loudly, he listened intently as if hearing our views for the very first time, and asked questions that made us pause, rewrite, and reconsider. But in today's world, his philosophy feels increasingly rare. Instead of seeking nuance, our social feeds constantly reinforce our own beliefs. Opinions harden into facts. This new world has erased all the beautiful grays, the midtones that made our country so very interesting. Stanley taught that understanding can only be found in the gray areas, not the black and white picture that we now see that lacks depth, perspective, tonality, and texture. Stanley would be saddened by our shrinking capacity for civil discourse, our dwindling ability to stand on common ground, and renew the moral compass that points to freedom, a compass set years ago by this country's founders, by immigrants passing through Ellis Island, and by the millions who now seek their journey here in hope. But I know if Stanley were here, he would find faith again in all of you, the students at CCNY, and once again find his religion, his unflappable belief that change is possible. This new generation of leaders will be those willing to listen, question, and seek understanding. Thank you to his former students. He loved you madly and fiercely. You gave him purpose, as I'm sure today's students do for their professors. Carry his legacy forward, seek the gray areas, nurture dialogue, shape the future, build the world in full color. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for joining us in this wonderful conversation. Thank you, Rick and Mike, and thank you to the students of Stanley Feingold who came out to honor the lasting influence of Stanley Feingold. Thank you very much.